So, welcome to the interview. For my first question, can you speak on the long-lasting importance of your textbook, Petticoats and Prejudice, and how it's still relevant today?
Well, I think that the significance of history is being ignored, diminished, disrespected. I'm very curious, as I think many readers will be, about what life was like for women in the 19th century, in the 1800s in Canada. And I think it's a shame that it is not known, that less and less of it is taught, and that students in their university years are choosing not to take courses relating to history. So that's sort of my first lament. Why is it still important? I think we can see patterns from the years that are so far away from us that tell us about, or at least leave us asking questions. Is it still the same? Can we still see evidence of discrimination, of mistreatment of women, of the inferior status of women in Canada? And certainly many of my students, when they read this, they say, oh my gosh, so much is still happening here that looks just like the years of the 1800s. So I think recognizing patterns, learning about the ways in which women have been mistreated historically gives us energy, inspiration to think about how the world could be different.
That's a great answer. For my second question, what first inspired you to write this book?
I started the research in 1979. That's many decades ago. And it took me about 11 years before I finished it. But I was very active in the feminist movement, which we now refer to as second wave feminism in Canada, which was an exhilarating and wonderful group of feminist women. It was just my great good fortune to be active in those decades with a feminist community. And they were battling everything. They wanted equal pay for women. They wanted an end to sexual violence. They wanted an end to domestic violence. They wanted more women in the professions. They wanted equality in family law. They were fighting for it on all fronts for equality for women. And they said to me, because they knew I was a historian, they said, could you find us some heroines from history? We would like to know the names of women who were women we would have admired even then and now. Come back with a list of feminist heroines. Actually, I went on a sabbatical year and they said, your challenge this year is to come back with a list of feminist heroines. So that was very exciting to me as a challenge. It was a great feminist community in London, Ontario. And so I took it seriously. And I started to write the stories of legal history, not as sort of an abstract academic study, but stories. Who were the women that we need to know about, who we can rescue from oblivion? I think of them, it's strange, but I think of pulling them back from the grave. Their stories are so meaningful and they were so courageous. And so Ellen Rogers, I think, is one of my very, very favorite. In
Mm,
1858, the criminal law system was very rudimentary. They often relied not on the police to lay charges, but on civilians, on citizens who had been subjected to some crime. There was no television, there was no streaming of films or news. So people went to the courthouse for entertainment. You would just spend an afternoon or a morning there listening to what was going on. But this time, there was a whole group of men who took the seats in the courtroom and they jeered Ellen Rogers and Mary
yeah.
Hunt. and they laughed and they were crude and they were loud. And the judge kept trying to calm them down, but to no avail. And
Mhm.
so Ellen Rogers was examined in cross-examination,
Mm.
and all of the cross-examination was done to sort of trip Ellen Rogers up on minor details, to probe her reputation as a prostitute, a woman of ill repute, as they called it, degraded, immoral. And she stood there throughout all of it and said, I deserve not to be raped. And in the end, she was speaking through tears as she stood there in front of a jeering crowd of men and a horrible defense lawyer who was cross-examining her mercilessly. And the result was an acquittal. And so I think often of Ellen Rogers when I think about women today who are testifying um, in circumstances that seem to me grossly unfair, in which their word is not believed. They are treated as not credible. They are tortured on the witness stand. And then the result in the courtroom is typically another acquittal. But I think about Ellen Rogers and what she represents to us today as somebody whose situation was, I think, in some ways worse. And yet she spoke through tears. And it's an image that will always stay with me.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, it's enraging, but it's also heartening that we don't lose our voice entirely. And that the women who came before us would be cheering us on today.
That's a great answer. I'd like to go back to the beginning of that answer when you're talking about the word heroine. I know in your introduction, you say the word heroine is ever evolving. How would you define the word today? And would you say the word has been reclaimed?
It was fun to be on the hunt for heroines, but I did have to ask myself, what does that word mean? And of course, I grew up with fairy tales, as do most children today, and it was the damsel in distress rescued by the brawny, strong prince on a horseback. Um, it was somewhat overturned by the lovely child's book called The Paper Bag Princess, where she turns out to rescue the prince in the end. And that's lovely. Uh, I thought we should just round it out even more and think about women who appear to have lost everything, but who are still resisting, who are still standing in some way. And I think they deserve to be remembered and praised for the fact that they were trampled over. So I went looking for those two.
I really like that definition. And The Paper Bag Princess is a classic, and I do love that book. If you're writing Petticoats and Prejudice today or revising it, is there anything you do differently?
No.
Great
Loved
answer.
I loved writing this book. It took a very many years. I think I did sort of one or two stories a year. I was teaching full time at the law school, so I wasn't writing full time. But
Mhm.
um, each story was one that touched me deeply, and so I love teaching with it. I'm surprised at the reaction of my students in the law school at the University of Ottawa, where I teach. They have no idea about this history. They're shocked to discover, that women could not own property, that
Mm.
women were barred from the profession of law. I mean, now there are even numbers of men and women in the law school, but all the way through this century, there was just one woman who made it through as a lawyer, and she had to fight for years to be admitted. So I think that women are taken aback by how dreadful the legal situation was, but they are also struck by how much of these narratives resonates today.
And that really relates to one of my other questions, which was, in the time since its publication, have readers or students shared reactions that surprised or moved you?
Well, I think one of the biggest reactions I get from students is on the chapter about the tort of seduction. A tort is when somebody goes to court and asks someone else to have to pay damages because they've been harmed. And there are many torts that were existing then that don't exist anymore, but there are many that still exist. So if you get injured in the workplace, seriously injured, or in a car accident, or in any other way, the common law would have provided for an action where you seek compensation. In the 19th century, and well into the 20th, there was a tort of seduction. And it allowed a father to claim compensation if his daughter had been impregnated. He claimed compensation for his loss because his daughter would have, done chores in the family home, might have worked for pay in which she sent her wages home before she was married. And so she couldn't work for him, was the theory. And it was, as it turns out, one of the lawsuits that was most prevalent in Ontario in the 1800s. And many lawyers' offices actually paid their rent based on the tort of seduction. It was just just slap a few more lawsuits on, we'll get our fees and we'll be able to pay the rent on the law office. So it was a really big cause of action. And the women are so staggered that it's the father who's entitled to compensation, not them. The tort of seduction didn't apply to them. And that the money goes to him. Who knew if he paid them any share of it? And it was, I think, in some ways, an unusual action in Ontario because jurors, they were often jury trials, were very sympathetic to the fathers and very cross with the young men who had impregnated the daughter. And so consequently, they awarded damages all the time. They believed the fathers. They never believed the rape victims, but this was an action by the father. And so it was men. I should mention, all the juries were male. No women were allowed to be jurors.
Yeah, I
No
figured
women were
that.
allowed to be judges. Women are facing an entirely male system that is just steeped in unequal notions of patriarchy.
Looking back, what do you remember most vividly about the research and writing process for this book? In your introduction, you mentioned your feminist reading group, the Hags and Crones, helped inspire your framework. Can you also speak on the importance of a writing community?
Yes, I don't think this book would have appeared without my fabulous feminist reading group. And I recommend to all listeners that if you don't have a feminist reading group, you should. Keep reading books, meet, talk, laugh, cry. You need company to properly dissect both our history and our current problems as women. You need a good company. And so, yes, that was absolutely essential. They also asked me to speak about this book a lot. So there were all kinds of occasions, there was Person's Day and there was International Women's Day and there was Take Back the Night and there would be all these various events in London, Ontario. There are actually fewer of those today, which is sad, but I would be asked to speak. And so they make great speeches, each of these stories. And I I was not a good speaker when I began this book, but I learned. And I think that's the other word I would give to women. Many women are today still reluctant to speak. And I think you need practice. And the words of these women, their stories, I think give us heart to start practicing, exercising our voice and our speech and asking to have our stories told and respected.
I was going to ask how this book helped shape your future work.
I knew when I started down the road of a career as a law professor that it would
Mhm.
be as a feminist law professor. And I
Yeah,
wasn't alone in that. There was a very small group of women starting to teach. We were some of the early women, full-time career makers in the law schools. And there were a whole bunch of women lawyers who were defining themselves as feminist lawyers. And so we had support both in our work setting and out in the wider society of feminists in law. And yes, I did continue I taught with this book. I still teach with this book, but I had students who were racialized students in the university. Mainly, I also taught in women's studies for a while, and there were more racialized women there than there were in law school for most of those years. But they said to me, there are not enough women of Black heritage, of Asian heritage. There's not enough Indigenous women. Your research needs to expand. We were there in history, and we need to be included in your writing. And so initially I said, well, I'd love to write about them, but there's no literature out there that I can draw on. Women's history was still in its early years in Canada, and it was mainly white. And they said to me, well, that's not a good answer, Professor Backhouse. You need to write the literature. It's up to you to fix this problem. And I was kind of drew in my breath because it was already pretty hard finding all these stories about women's legal history, which hadn't been told before. But I thought, these women students are very courageous. They're just like the women that I found in Petticoats and Prejudice. And maybe they're right. So I then embarked the plan was to do a fairly short book on racialized women in legal history. But I quickly discovered that it should not be a short book. There were lots of stories out there. And I needed to also study about what racism did to men who were in the legal system. So yes, this book, the reaction to this book really shaped where my career then went.
that is excellent. And I definitely get a hint of that even in your introduction for the book, where you said, I would have loved to talk more about it, but the research was difficult. And so it's nice to see that someone said, well, too bad, do the
I
research. And
know.
you're like, oh, okay, I guess so.
And they were right.
And they were right.
And I
Perfect.
discovered that.
Did one of the stories stand out to you as a favorite to research and write about?
Well, let's talk about Clara Brett Martin.
Okay.
I could also talk about the famous Esther R. Scott, who was a brothel keeper who had enough money to hire the famous lawyers from the Toronto firms of Oslers and McCarthy's. And, she had the most expensive, high profile male lawyers she could find. And she basically beat the system that was prosecuting her for running a brothel. So I mean, that was a victory. That was fun. And that was also in London, Ontario. And it's
Mhm.
really fun to do research where you're living, which was where I was living at the time. And many students, because these cases span the country, they're all the way, in the Maritimes, in the Atlantic provinces, in the West, in the prairies, in Ontario, in Quebec. And so the students who come from there say, oh my gosh, this is kind of like my history. So that's also, I think, really important. But I was going to say, Clara Brett Martin was Canada's first woman lawyer. She was also the first woman lawyer in the British Commonwealth. So she's really carrying a lot on her shoulders. It took her, I think, 6 or 7 years to break through the barriers that the Ontario legal profession had put in front of her. Lawyers at the time and still today get admitted to the practice of law by province. And so she had to go in front of the Law Society in Toronto, where she lived. And she was an upper class woman, as were quite a number of the early women lawyers. She had enough family money to really allow her to go to university in an era. She went to the University of Toronto in an era where almost no women were students. And she studied mathematics, which was even more unusual then and today. And she then got admitted to study law and to article law clerk in a law office. And that was a huge struggle, which she managed to do in part because she was friends with the Chief Justice's daughter. And so she had the backing of powerful people. She also had the hostility of the vast bulk of the legal profession, who met in droves to write about this ridiculous notion that women could be lawyers. And they had all kinds of arguments. First of all, they said women's brains were very different from men, and they were trained. Their capacity was to be wives and mothers in the home, and to basically they could understand nursery rhymes, but they weren't rational, so they could never comprehend law. They wouldn't be able to read it properly, and they wouldn't be able to make a logical argument. So that was the first thing. Our brains would just not fit practice of law.
Yeah.
But then they also said that male judges and juries, out of gallantry, would let the woman lawyer win. So they couldn't possibly have women in the courtroom. And I was thinking, yeah, well, it didn't help the rape victims very much, Not sure that's the best argument, guys. But they also said, if we let them be lawyers, well, what will happen to our homes and our children? Who will cook our dinners? Who will clean our houses? We simply can't fathom this. And it took, all kinds of pressures from some men. A lot of powerful women got into the act, and women who were married to powerful men, essentially. And in addition, I think Clara Brett Martin herself was just stellar. She was brilliant. She passed all of her exams wonderfully. She was a very good law clerk. And so ultimately, with the support of the then Attorney General in Toronto, who threatened the lawyers that if they didn't let her in, they would be in trouble with the law themselves, she was admitted in 1897.
For my final question, I have, is there anything else you'd like to say about the book in general, or any takeaways you want people to leave with?
I love this book. I love the women in it. I love that the format of it is accessible. You can read it without being a lawyer. You can read it without being a law student. I actually think you can read it if you're not even in university. I think these stories open themselves up to general readers. And so we talked about the usefulness of it today. I want to just make a claim for it as just sheer fascinating information. It is mind-bending to learn about the bravery of some of these women, about the courage that they exhibited in fighting for women's equality, about the ways that those voices were trampled down, and we deserve to pull them back up from that grave and hear what they had to say and what they did on our behalf. And I find that calming, actually, in the face of today's world, which is so tumultuous and so depressing in terms of gender equality and discrimination, so many other fronts. This is good reading, I think. And so I wish for a lot of readers still to come.
I agree. I thought your narrative it was really well done. And I don't think you need to be a university or college student to read it. And I think it is very important work.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed speaking with you hugely. Thank you.